There are things out there that don't belong in the daylight, creatures whose very existence defies logic and shatters comfort. They watch from the darkness, hidden in the folds of ancient forests, in the frozen breath of remote mountains, waiting. Legends call them by many names: Bigfoot, Yeti, Sasquatch. But names mean nothing when you're staring into eyes that gleam with a primal, malevolent intelligence. Tonight, we journey deep into the shadows, where silence grows heavy and something unseen breathes just beyond the tree line. These are not campfire stories. These are the encounters that leave scars, and they might just make you a believer. Story 1. The Cabin Under Siege. My family owns a cabin deep in the mountains, a sturdy old structure that's been standing longer than I've been alive. My great-grandfather built the original two-room section by hand, and over the decades my grandfather, father, and I each added to it, expanding it into a cozy but rugged two-story five-room place with a porch overlooking the woods. Upstairs is where the bedrooms are, just two twin beds and a battered old dresser. Downstairs there's a living room, a kitchen with a vintage gas stove, a small bathroom, and a study lined with worn-out bookshelves. My grandfather's massive steel-tankered desk still dominates the study, weighed down with ancient hunting, fishing, and trapping manuals, alongside a pile of old sci-fi paperbacks my dad devoured as a kid. It felt like the perfect place to spend the summer. Instead of taking a job between college semesters, I volunteered to stay there and maintain the property. Lately, some of the neighbors had been complaining about vandalism and theft, and Dad was worried the cabin might get broken into. Living there would give me a chance to do some good, while also giving me the peace and quiet I needed after a brutal semester. I loaded up the old Ford Bronco with food, camping supplies, tools, and the basics for rough living. I also packed my grandpa's old Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver for safety, and a battered hunting rifle just in case. Most importantly, I brought Roscoe, my loyal Australian shepherd. If there was ever a dog built for this kind of adventure, it was him. Smart, protective, and always ready to chase off anything that didn't belong. The drive to the cabin took about 5 hours, winding through increasingly empty country roads until civilization gave way to endless trees. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the place greeted me with the kind of pure silence you can only find way out in the woods. No car horns, no voices, just the sound of the wind sighing through the trees. I didn't know it yet, but that silence wouldn't last long. The first few days passed by without anything too unusual. I settled into a steady routine, waking up early, mowing the grass around the cabin, trimming back the trails, checking the solar panels, and clearing out old deer blinds that had nearly been swallowed by the woods. Roscoe stayed close by my side the entire time, though I started to notice something strange about him. Every so often, he'd freeze mid-stride, his ears perked up, and his eyes locked onto the dense tree line. He would stare for long, tense moments, the fur along his spine bristling, before giving a low whine and eventually returning to whatever he was doing. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a raccoon, a deer, or even just the scent of an old bear trail. But deep down I knew Roscoe didn't spook easily. On the second night I was cooking some dinner, Wolf brand chili on the old gas stove, because real chili doesn't have beans, no matter what anyone says, when the motion lights at the back of the cabin flickered on. Peeking out the window, I spotted a fat raccoon skulking around the trash cans, and I laughed it off. I didn't realize at the time how comforting that explanation was. I ate my dinner in the living room, book in hand, trying to enjoy the evening. But the lights outside kept flickering intermittently. I chalked it up to the raccoon being persistent, or maybe the wind playing tricks on the sensors. The next day, while working on the fence line, I noticed that Roscoe's strange behavior was escalating. He wouldn't stray more than a few feet from me, his body rigid, his tail tucked low. his nose constantly testing the wind. Several times he growled low under his breath at seemingly nothing. The battery system too had started acting up. The inverter wasn't charging properly, leaving me worried that the generator would have to run longer than I wanted. It felt like little things were beginning to stack up, subtle, almost easy to dismiss, but still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mountains, an uncomfortable heaviness had settled over the cabin, like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching. I told myself it was just nerves. I was alone out here after all, and maybe I was just getting spooked by the isolation. Still, Roscoe wouldn't settle down, and deep in my gut, I knew something wasn't right. It was sometime around mid-afternoon the next day when things took a sharp turn. I had decided to head deeper into the woods to check more of the old fence line. Roscoe stayed glued to my side, his body tense, his ears flicking at every sound. I kept my grandpa's old revolver holstered on my hip more out of habit than fear, at least that's what I told myself. The woods were alive with the usual sounds, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, but there was an edge to it, like the forest was uneasy. I was halfway down the trail, near the creek that split the property, when Roscoe suddenly froze, his entire body rigid. His lips curled back in a snarl, and before I could react, he exploded into the undergrowth, barking and snarling like a wild thing. Startled, I drew the revolver and shouted after him, my voice echoing uselessly through the trees. For a few heart-pounding seconds, I didn't hear anything except my own breath. Then came the crash. Something big, moving fast through the brush, pursued by my dog. I sprinted after the noise, crashing through the undergrowth, fear blooming in my chest. The logical part of me screamed that Roscoe was chasing a bear, maybe a wild boar. I couldn't even see them, just the shaking of the branches and the pounding of something heavy on the forest floor. Then, just as suddenly, Roscoe yelped, a sharp, terrified cry that punched straight through me. Seconds later, he came barreling back through the trees, his tail tucked between his legs, his body shaking. His eyes were wide with a fear I'd never seen before. Right behind him, from somewhere deeper in the woods, came a roar, a low, deep, bone-rattling sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a bear. I don't know what it was, but every primal instinct in my body told me I didn't want to meet it face to face. Without thinking, I turned and ran back toward the cabin, Roscoe right on my heels. I didn't stop until we were inside. The door slammed and locked behind us. I loaded the rifle I had brought almost as an afterthought and sat in the living room, staring out the windows, every nerve on edge. Out there, something massive was moving through my woods, and it knew we were here. The rest of that afternoon passed in a strange, tight silence. I stayed inside the cabin with Roscoe, the rifle loaded and ready, my revolver tucked into the waistband of my jeans. Every few minutes, I would walk quietly from window to window, peering out at the tree line, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no sound, just the oppressive weight of the woods pressing in from all sides. Even Roscoe wouldn't leave my side. He followed me from room to room, his body low to the ground, tail tucked, ears flattened. Whatever he'd encountered, out there had shaken him to his core. As the sun began to dip and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, the unease inside the cabin thickened. I started the generator early, needing the comfort of the lights, needing something to fight back the growing darkness. I made myself dinner, barely touching it, and fed Roscoe, who picked at his food before curling up in a tight ball beneath the kitchen table. The evening dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last, until finally I decided to try to sleep. Revolver under my pillow, rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke to the sharp metallic clatter of something hitting the cabin wall. My heart leapt into my throat. Roscoe was already up, growling low in his chest, staring at the front door. Another thud, this time from the back of the cabin. I grabbed the rifle and crept to the window, careful to keep out of sight. In the pale glow of the motion-triggered lights, I could just make out a rock the size of a softball rolling to a stop on the ground outside. Someone, or something, was throwing rocks at the cabin. I shouted into the night, warning whoever was out there that I was armed, but there was no reply. Just the steady, deliberate thud of more rocks striking the walls. One cracked against a window, spiderwebbing the glass but not breaking it. My hands were shaking as I chambered a round and fired a shot into the air. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and for a moment there was blessed silence. Then it started again. This time not just rocks, but sticks, pine cones, anything that could be thrown. It came in waves like a storm battering the cabin. Some of the projectiles hit hard enough to make the walls vibrate. Roscoe barked furiously, but wouldn't leave the spot beneath the table. A stick crashed through one of the upstairs windows, sending a spray of glass across the floor. Fueled by adrenaline and rising panic, I fired another round, this time into the woods where I thought the barrage was coming from. Again, the forest fell silent, but it didn't stay that way. A guttural roar tore through the trees, so loud and so alien that every hair on my body stood on end. I backed away from the window, rifle raised, pulse pounding in my ears. Before I could react, a rock the size of a cantaloupe slammed into the wall beside the door, knocking a picture frame to the ground. I stumbled back, realizing with cold horror that this wasn't some drunk hiker or a group of teenagers playing pranks. This was deliberate. This was an attack, and whatever was out there wasn't afraid of me. Not the dog, not the cabin, not even the gunfire. It wanted me to know that I was trespassing. It wanted me to be afraid, and God help me, it was succeeding. I don't know how long I sat there, heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the next strike. The seconds dragged out into minutes, the minutes into what felt like hours. The air inside the cabin grew stifling, thick with fear and the metallic scent of sweat. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight, every creak of the old wood under my boots sounding like a gunshot. Roscoe had gone dead silent under the table, his eyes fixed on the back window. That was the first warning. The motion lights blinked, on again, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the kitchen where I had the best line of sight to the backyard. I barely made it 3 steps before something caught my eye. Movement, just outside the kitchen window. I froze, rifle raised, straining to see through the glass and the darkness beyond it. And then I saw it. 2 eyes, glowing faintly in the pale light, staring in at me. The face they belonged to was massive, far too high off the ground for any normal animal. The window was almost 7 feet up, and whatever this was, it was looking in at me easily. The shape was more shadow than substance, but the outline was clear. A hulking figure, broad-shouldered, completely filling the frame. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood there paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it, the impossibility of what I was seeing. Then, as if it realized I was frozen, the creature leaned closer, pressing a huge, gnarled hand against the glass. The window groaned under the pressure, small cracks spiderwebbing outward from where its fingers splayed. Instinct finally kicked in. I raised the rifle and fired. The shot shattered the window, blasting glass and wood splinters everywhere. I didn't know if I hit it, but the creature jerked back with an ear-splitting shriek, something so raw and furious it made my skin crawl. I chambered another round as Roscoe barked madly, the noise inside the cabin deafening. I ran to the kitchen door, flung it open, and scanned the yard. The motion lights were still on, throwing harsh light across the clearing, but the thing was gone, already swallowed by the forest. I caught only the barest glimpse of it retreating, a dark shape crashing through the trees with inhuman speed. The window was ruined, cold night air pouring in. I shoved a heavy piece of plywood against it, hammering it into place with trembling hands. I could still hear it out there somewhere in the woods, pacing just beyond the reach of the light, waiting. Whatever it wasn't finished with me yet. Night fell heavy and absolute, the kind of darkness that swallowed the world whole beyond the feeble circle of the motion lights. I was trapped inside the cabin, a tiny island of flickering lights surrounded by an ocean of unseen threats. Every window was barricaded, every door bolted, the rifle and revolver both fully loaded and within reach. Roscoe lay near the kitchen door, still trembling, but ready to defend if he had to. It felt less like a home now, and more like a crumbling fort under siege. The barrage resumed sometime after midnight. Stones, sticks, and debris slammed against the walls with maddening persistence, as if the forest itself had turned against me. Each thud vibrated through the wooden frame, making the cabin groan in protest. Occasionally I caught glimpses of dark shapes darting just beyond the light, too fast and too large to be anything human. I fired several shots into the darkness, but it made no difference. If anything, the attacks grew bolder. At one point, I heard something heavy thudding against the back door, slow and deliberate, as if testing the strength of the hinges. Roscoe growled low, a rumble so deep it barely registered as sound. I could hear them breathing, harsh, wet exhalations carried on the wind through the broken seals of the window frames. Sleep was impossible. I sat with my back against the wall, the rifle across my knees, straining my ears for any sign that they might try to break in. Every minute stretched like an hour, and I found myself counting the shots left in my revolver, wondering if I had enough to make it through till dawn. I wasn't sure if I was going to survive the night, but if they wanted me, they were going to have to come through a hell of a lot of lead to get me. Story 2. The Yeti cover-up in Nepal. A few years back, I landed what I thought was a dream gig, a job as a camera operator for a Discovery Channel special about the Yeti. At the time, I was working mostly wedding photography, trying to scrape by, but deep down I always wanted something more exciting, something wild. It just so happened that a college friend of mine who filmed extreme nature shows for Discovery fell seriously ill right before a major trip to Nepal. He recommended me as his replacement, and within a week, I was on a plane bound for Kathmandu. The whole thing felt surreal. Meeting the crew at the airport, a rugged Aussie named Rob who was hosting the show, a quiet guy named Willie who was the other cameraman, and Karen, the assistant producer, felt like stepping into someone else's life. We were all jet-lagged and stiff from the flight, but there was an undeniable buzz in the air. This wasn't just another gig. This was the kind of opportunity that could make a career. Kathmandu itself was an assault on the senses, dense, loud, chaotic, and smothered in smog. It was nothing like the glossy travel brochures I had glanced at before the trip. The smell of dust and gasoline hung in the air, and every street pulsed with a kind of raw, frantic energy. Willie, who blended in better thanks to his Filipino heritage, managed to flag us a cab, and we headed to a worn-out but serviceable Western-style hotel where Karen had booked our rooms. That night, despite the exhaustion gnawing at me, I couldn't sleep. The idea of tracking down an ancient legend in the shadow of the Himalayas churned in my gut, an electric mix of excitement and dread. I had no idea then that what we were about to encounter would change everything, and that some stories were never meant to be told. The next morning, after a restless night spent tossing and turning, we met downstairs in the lobby to plan our first real day of shooting. Karen, fresh-faced and buzzing with nervous energy, announced that she'd arranged a meeting with our local guide, a Sherpa named Harish, who lived in a village nestled high up in the Himalayas. Until then, we had the day free to acclimate to the altitude and soak in our surroundings. I grabbed my camera and wandered out into the streets of Kathmandu, hungry to capture the city's raw heartbeat. Kathmandu wasn't beautiful in the way travel magazines made it seem. It was alive in a way that felt almost overwhelming. Thick crowds pressed together in narrow alleys, the clang of bells from street vendors hawking wares, the smell of incense and gasoline fighting for dominance in the heavy air. Everywhere I turned there was color. Vibrant prayer flags strung between buildings, marigold garlands hanging from temple gates, hand-painted signs fading under the relentless sun. It was chaotic, dizzying, and it was perfect. Later that afternoon, Karen and I stumbled upon a gathering in a nearby square. A small crowd had formed around a dancer in a brilliant gold silk robe and a grotesque papier-mâché mask painted blood red with white, bulging eyes and long fangs. The dancer whirled to the frantic rhythm of drums and flutes, every movement sharp and wild. Karen, who spoke a little Nepali, managed to ask one of the drummers about the mask. After a few confused exchanges, the drummer simply grinned and said one word: "Lo." That night, curious, I tried to look it up online using the hotel's painfully slow internet. I found a reference: Lo, a kind of guardian spirit or demon from local folklore, believed to protect villages from evil. Reading about it made a cold shiver creep down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. It wasn't just superstition. It felt like a warning. The next morning we met Harish. He was a wiry man with weathered skin and kind, sharp eyes, and he spoke English well enough to brief us on what lay ahead. We would be heading 8 hours northeast into territory where most roads were little more than dusty scars across the mountainside. Harish promised us breathtaking scenery, thin air, and maybe, if we were lucky or unlucky, a glimpse of the creature the locals had spoken about for generations. The next morning, just as the sun crested the jagged horizon, we piled into a battered rental truck and left the choked chaos of Kathmandu behind. As the city fell away, so did the paved roads. We bounced and rattled our way through endless stretches of farmland, the fields slowly giving way to dense jungle and steep, unforgiving mountains. The air grew thinner, cooler and cleaner with every mile, but there was an undeniable weight pressing down on us, a quietness that had nothing to do with altitude. Harish drove with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his entire life navigating these treacherous trails. Occasionally, he would point out small villages clinging to the mountainsides or shrines hidden among the trees. Each time he'd share a story about how travelers sometimes went missing, about the strange footprints found near dried riverbeds, about the unexplainable sounds that echoed through the valleys at night. Rob eagerly filmed snippets of Harish's stories from the passenger seat, while Willie and I captured B-roll footage of the breathtaking, if unsettling, landscapes. By the time we reached Harish's village, the sun was low and the mountains cast long, eerie shadows across the narrow streets. The village was a rough patchwork of concrete, tin and timber, tougher than it looked, built to withstand the brutal winters and landslides. We stayed in the only hotel, a bare-bones two-story building where the beds were thin mattresses laid directly on cold concrete floors. It wasn't luxury, but it was shelter. Harish insisted we start early the next morning. He told us that the creature, whatever it was most active near the river gorge at dawn. That night, as I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, the noises of the village seemed amplified. The distant bark of dogs, the low murmur of wind dragging across the roofs, the creak of old timber. But it was the silence beyond the village, out in the vast darkness of the jungle, that truly unnerved me. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the feeling that something out there was waiting. Before sleep finally took me, I thought about the dancer in the square, the red mask with the white eyes and fangs. I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the Locals wore those masks not just for protection, but because sometimes something really came looking. We left the village before sunrise, our breath fogging in the icy air. Harish led us away from the narrow roads, cutting through fields and slipping into the dense, tangled jungle. It was slow going. The terrain was rough and the footing treacherous, but Harish moved with quiet confidence. The rest of us stumbled after him, weighed down by camera gear and gnawing nerves. The gorge wasn't far, and when we reached it, the sight was surreal. The river that had once carved its path through the earth was now reduced to a thin silver thread, the result of a dam project farther upstream. Sandy banks stretched out where rushing water had once been, littered with stones and bleached driftwood. The early light gave the whole place an eerie, washed-out quality, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Harish guided us along the bank, pointing out footprints left by bears, monkeys, and even, to our amazement, a tiger. We filmed everything, meticulously, but Harish kept insisting we were close to something different, something special. After nearly an hour of trekking, we came to a bend where a sheer cliff loomed overhead, its shadows swallowing half the gorge, and there, pressed into the damp sand, was a footprint. It was massive, easily the size of a full-grown man's torso. Unlike the paw prints of a bear or the narrow impressions of a primate, this footprint had an almost human shape. 4 toes, a wider pad where a big opposable toe might be, and deep, sharp indentations where heavy weight had compacted the ground. It wasn't perfect, parts of it blurred by the shifting sand, but it was enough. It was real. We took photographs, measurements, footage, everything we could think of. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to find some rational explanation, but standing there, camera in hand, I couldn't shake the chill crawling up my spine. This was no prank, no hoax. Whatever had made that print was real, and it was big. Harish, almost whispering, mentioned a cave further up into the jungle where sightings had been reported before. Rob, sensing an opportunity to make television history, immediately latched onto the idea. We packed our gear and began the hike uphill toward the cliffs. The jungle thickened as we climbed. Vines coiled around the trees like snakes, and strange cries echoed from the canopy. Every step felt heavier, like the very earth was reluctant to let us pass. Finally, after what felt like hours of scrambling and hacking our way through dense foliage, we came upon it, a gash in the hillside, half hidden by tangled roots and undergrowth. The entrance was low, barely 5 feet high, but it was wide enough that something large could come and go with ease. The air that wafted out of the cave was cold and rank, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of damp earth and something else, something sour, almost coppery. We filmed the entrance while Rob narrated, his voice low but steady. None of us said it aloud, but we were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't just a cave, it was a lair, and something still called it home. The moment we stepped into the mouth of the cave, the world seemed to tighten around us. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, the beams bouncing off rough, damp walls. The further we went, the lower the ceiling dropped, forcing us to stoop. It was claustrophobic, the air stale and metallic, each breath harder than the last. Rob moved ahead, narrating into the camera, while Willie and I followed, filming every tense step. We had barely ventured 30 yards inside when Rob stumbled, his foot striking something on the ground. I swung my camera down and froze. It wasn't a rock. It was a man, naked, filthy, curled into a fetal position, muttering incoherently. Harish rushed forward and rolled him over gently. The man's skin was pale and bruised, his body emaciated, and there were 2 strange puncture wounds on his side. He was still alive, barely. Shock rippled through us, but before we could react further, a shrill screech echoed from the cave entrance, the same blood-curdling cry we had heard earlier. Slowly we turned toward the sound. In the flashlight's narrow beam, a silhouette loomed, tall, lanky, completely hairless except for a mass of matted fur on its head. It held something writhing in its mouth, and with a sickening crunch it bit down. A broken, meaty sound echoed through the cave. For a moment, the creature's enormous white eyes locked onto mine through the camera lens. Instinct took over. We grabbed the injured man, half carrying, half dragging him as we stumbled back toward the entrance. Every step felt like a lifetime. I could hear the creature moving behind us, low, guttural breathing growing closer. We burst into the jungle, scrambling over rocks and fallen trees, never daring to look back. The only thought pounding through my skull was primal and absolute. Run. We stumbled back into Harish's village well after dark, battered, bloodied, and terrified. The villagers gathered around us, whispering prayers and casting wary glances at the jungle beyond. Harish called for a local doctor, who immediately tended to the injured man. Jacques, we learned, a French engineer who had been missing for weeks. He mumbled incoherent warnings about the creature and being hunted, but no one pressed him for more. Rob and Karen made the decision quickly. We would return to Kathmandu and hand over the footage to Discovery. We thought we had something, world-changing, undeniable proof that something lived out there, something the world needed to see. But once we returned, everything changed. Discovery executives reviewed the footage in a closed session, their expressions hard and unreadable. We were ordered to turn in all our equipment at the airport, promised that they would be in touch. Weeks passed, then months. No special aired. Emails were ignored. Attempts to retrieve our footage were met with vague excuses and legal threats. Rumors surfaced that the project had been shelved, classified even. Powerful interests, we heard, wanted it buried. Bound by NDA, I stayed silent until now. Some truths are too important to stay hidden. Story 3. The Soldier's Encounter in Frozen Alberta. I'm a 62-year-old man now, but there are some things that time just can't dull. I grew up hearing stories from my mother and grandmother, who were Cree natives, about the Wendigo, how it lurked in the forests, how it preyed on the unwary. My mother especially made sure I never forgot those old warnings. "Be careful out there," she said, when I left home to join the Canadian Armed Forces. "There are things in the wild that don't care about guns or uniforms." I was young, ambitious, and thought I was invincible. After basic training, I completed my tradesman course and received my first assignment. Communications specialist for the Special Service Forces in Petawawa, Ontario. It was an elite posting, and I wore the badge with pride. Part of my job involved repairing and maintaining telecommunication equipment, which required a top-secret security clearance. I trained hard, pushing my limits every day, ready to face any threat, man or otherwise. In December, during one of Ontario's harshest winters, we were flown by helicopter to a mountaintop near Algonquin Provincial Park for a week-long winter warfare course. The landscape was a frozen hellscape of snow, wind, and bitter cold, the kind that cut right through even our thickest gear. Each of us was assigned rotating guard shifts throughout the nights. It was tough, but it was just another part of our training, or so I thought. On one of those nights, under a sky so clear and cold it felt like glass, I stood guard at the edge of camp. The temperature had plummeted to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of lost souls. I tightened my jacket, stomped my feet to stay warm, and scanned the darkness beyond our little cluster of tents. It was supposed to be a routine watch, another test of endurance. But that night something was waiting for me out there, something my training had never prepared me for. At first, it was just the usual sounds of the forest, trees creaking under the weight of ice, the distant crack of branches snapping in the brutal cold. I paced back and forth near the perimeter of our camp, my boots crunching over frozen snow, the breath hissing from my mouth in thick clouds. Then I heard it. Voices, faint but unmistakable, drifting up from the slope below. I stopped dead, straining to listen. They sounded distant, almost conversational, like 2 or 3 people murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I immediately did a head count, scanning the tents. Everyone was accounted for, bundled up and dead asleep. No one from our group was missing. The rational part of my brain insisted it had to be the wind playing tricks, but the voices were too distinct, too deliberate. Some came from the right, some from the left, overlapping and weaving through the darkness. They carried an odd, almost musical cadence, like a foreign tongue I couldn't quite place. Asian, maybe, but who would be out here 20 miles deep into frozen wilderness in the dead of night at 30 below? I called out sharply, "Who goes there? Identify yourself. You're on a Canadian Armed Forces base." My voice echoed off the frozen trees and died in the night. There was no reply, just silence. And then faintly a laugh or something like it echoed back from the woods. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. I tightened my grip on my rifle, the bayonet already fixed, since we weren't allowed live ammunition during training. It didn't feel like a prank. It didn't feel like anything human. I circled the camp twice, moving fast, bayonet ready, trying to shake the feeling that something unseen was circling me in return. Whatever was out there wasn't afraid of the cold or of me. The voices eventually faded, swallowed up by the night, but the unease they stirred in me clung like frost to my bones. When my replacement finally showed up, rubbing sleep from his eyes and shivering, he raised an eyebrow at the bayonet fixed on my rifle. I mumbled something about keeping warm with drills, unwilling to admit I was rattled. After all, what could I even say? That the forest had whispered my name? That the cold itself seemed alive? The following month, our entire brigade was relocated to Alberta for a massive winter training exercise near Wainwright. The landscape was different, more open, more rugged, but the same bitter cold gnawed at everything. One day, I was sent with a partner to repair a faulty communications unit set up somewhere deep in the training range. The roads were barely plowed, snowdrifts taller than the truck in some places, and the trees loomed like frozen sentries on either side of the trail. After 45 minutes of driving through a sea of white, we still hadn't found the equipment. I pulled the truck over to recheck the map, while my partner tried to pinpoint our location. Off to the right, maybe 100 feet away, there was a stand of pine trees broken by an open field. As I scanned the landscape, movement caught my eye, at heel. First I thought it was just a large deer, standing stiff and alert in the snow, ears perked, staring directly at us. Then the forest exploded. From the tree line, something massive barreled out into the open. It moved with terrifying speed, straight for the deer. I barely had time to shout before it reached the animal. In one horrifying, fluid motion, the creature grabbed the buck by its head and twisted. The sound, an awful wet snap, carried clearly across the frozen air. The deer dropped like a rag doll. The thing, whatever it was, stood over its kill, breathing heavily. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, with thick reddish-brown hair matted against a frame of impossible muscle. Its shoulders were broad enough to make it look almost deformed, and its head sat low between them with no visible neck. The arms were long, thick like tree limbs, and its hands seemed almost human but grotesquely large. Everything inside me screamed to run, but my body was frozen in place, locked between primal terror and disbelief. The creature heaved the dead buck onto its shoulder like it weighed nothing, then turned and loped back toward the woods in a few impossibly long strides. I finally forced myself to move, jamming the truck into gear. "Get in!" I barked at my partner, who was still standing outside the vehicle, eyes wide with shock. We tore out of there, the tires skidding and fighting for traction on the ice. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The engine growled as I pushed the truck harder than I should have, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever we had just seen. When we finally rolled back into the bivouac area, our sergeant took one look at us and asked what the hell had happened. I opened my mouth, tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? That we'd seen a monster, that something straight out of legend had just torn a deer apart in seconds? The sergeant must have seen something in my face, because he simply shook his head and said, "I don't want to hear about it." And just like that, the door slammed shut. I realized then that some things, no matter how real, were better left unspoken. In the military world. I didn't know it yet, but that encounter would haunt me for the rest of my life. It would lie dormant for years, a memory buried under layers of duty and discipline. But every now and then, in the dead of winter, when the world outside turned white and silent, I'd find myself staring out into the woods and remembering the way that creature moved, like a nightmare given flesh. Years went by and life carried me further away from that snowy clearing in Alberta. I served a full career in the army, traveled the world on peacekeeping missions, saw things that most people only read about in headlines. Strange animals, strange people, strange lands. I thought I'd seen it all, and yet nothing ever eclipsed the raw, bone-deep terror of that afternoon when I watched a creature, something that should not exist, snap a full-grown deer like it. It was nothing more than a twig. For a long time I kept the memory locked away, tucked in a corner of my mind where it couldn't touch my everyday life. After all, who would believe me? In the military, you learn quickly which stories to tell and which ones to bury. No one wants a guy talking about monsters when you're supposed to be focused on radios and security protocols. So I stayed quiet, carried it alone, convincing myself it had been some rare bear, a trick of the light, a mind playing games after weeks in brutal cold. But deep down, I knew better. As the years wore on, I started piecing it together. Reading accounts, researching cryptid sightings, even talking quietly with other soldiers who hinted at seeing things they couldn't explain. It always came back to the same thing, a being as old as the forests, as real as the blood in our veins, a creature that didn't care about borders or governments or reason. Looking back, I realize how lucky we were. It could have turned on us easily. We were nothing to it, just another part of the wilderness it ruled. Maybe it didn't see us as prey, maybe it simply didn't care. But that indifference, the idea that something so powerful could walk right past us without a second thought, that's what kept me awake on cold nights long after I retired. I still dream about that day sometimes. Not the gore, not the violence, but the way the world had fallen silent just before it appeared, like the earth itself had held its breath. And somewhere deep in the woods, when the wind is just right, I swear, I can still hear the crack of a deer's neck snapping, and the sound of something too big, too wild, walking back into the trees. Story 4. The Silent Stalker of Sawmill Mountain. Back in the early 90s, my best friend and I discovered a place that, for a while, felt like our own little secret slice of paradise. It was called Sawmill Mountain, tucked between Lake Hughes and Gorman in Southern California. You had to drive several miles down unimproved dirt roads just to reach the campground, and when you got there, it felt like stepping into another world. Quiet, isolated, perched high at about 5,000 feet, with a view that stretched for miles. No crowds, no noise, just endless sky and the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. We found it by accident after a disastrous camping trip at a more popular spot that had been overrun by loud groups from the city. We wanted solitude, a place where you could hear yourself think. When we rolled into Sawmill Mountain that first time, it was midday on a Saturday, and we were the only ones there. No park rangers, no other campers, just us, the trees, and the crisp mountain air. It felt perfect. We set up our tents, cooked a lazy lunch, and then my buddy crawled into his sleeping bag for a nap. I decided to do a little exploring. About 25 yards from camp, I found a narrow trail weaving through the woods. I followed it for 100 yards or so, taking in the scenery, the wildflowers blooming everywhere, the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional bird darting between branches. Everything was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That's when I first noticed it. The woods had gone utterly silent. No birds, no insects, just a heavy, oppressive stillness that pressed against my skin like a warning. It was so sudden, so complete, that it sent a jolt of pure instinctive fear through me. I stopped in my tracks, turning slowly, scanning the trees. I couldn't see anything, but every nerve in my body screamed that I was being watched. Hand resting on the grip of my Smith & Wesson 10mm, I called out my friend's name and started backing toward camp, moving carefully, refusing to turn my back on the trees. I didn't know what was out there, but every fiber of my being told me the same thing. I wasn't alone. Back at camp, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the altitude, or maybe my imagination running wild. But even after, I rejoined my buddy, who was casually sipping a beer by the fire pit. The unease clung to me like a second skin. I told him about the silence, about the overwhelming sense that something had been out there, watching. He listened, his expression slowly growing more serious, and then, without hesitation, said he'd felt the same thing earlier when setting up his tent. He hadn't said anything because he didn't want to spook me. That admission made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't just in my head. That night we stayed close to camp, keeping the fire big and bright. Every now and then, one of us would catch the other glancing nervously into the tree line. The woods were dense but not impenetrable. You could see movement if something large enough were lurking. Yet we saw nothing, no eyeshine, no shifting shadows, just an endless wall of darkness beyond the flickering firelight. The silence persisted, and it wasn't natural. Even in remote places you expect some sound at night, an owl hooting, a branch cracking, the scuttle of small creatures in the underbrush. But Sawmill Mountain offered nothing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Around midnight we heard it, a low guttural growl from somewhere beyond the perimeter of camp. It wasn't close, but it wasn't distant either. It came once deep and vibrating through the ground and then faded away. My buddy and I jumped up, flashlights and pistols drawn, scanning the trees. Again, nothing, no movement, no sound. But the feeling, the heavy, suffocating certainty that something was out there, only grew stronger. We didn't sleep much that night. Every time the fire started to die down, we threw more wood on it, desperate to keep the darkness at bay. We never saw what was watching us, but we could feel it, circling just beyond the reach of the light, patient and relentless. And deep down, we both understood something we couldn't quite admit out loud. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It knew we were there. It was waiting. We didn't return to Sawmill Mountain for a while after that first trip. Life got in the way, work, responsibilities, the usual distractions, but the memory of that night, the silence, the unseen watcher, stayed with us, an itch at the back of the mind that never really faded. Eventually, curiosity, and maybe a little stubborn pride, got the better of us. A couple of years later, we decided to go back, convinced that we had overreacted, that maybe it was just the altitude or the isolation playing tricks on our minds. This time, we were prepared. We brought more flashlights, more weapons, more people, but oddly enough, none of the others we invited ever seemed interested in coming when we mentioned where we were going. In the end, it was just the two of us again, driving up those same rough dirt roads to the same lonely patch of woods. At first, everything felt normal. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and sat around laughing about old times. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars came out in full force, that old suffocating stillness crept back in. It started small, just a sense of being watched, a prickle on the back of the neck. Then came the noises, faint rustling, beyond the edge of the trees, too deliberate to be the wind. We shined our flashlights into the woods, sweeping the beams back and forth. Nothing. But the feeling that something was out there only grew stronger. We moved closer to the trees, calling, out, trying to spook whatever it was. That's when we heard it, a low, throaty growl, closer this time. It wasn't the growl of a mountain lion or a bear. It was deeper, heavier, like it came from something massive. We bolted back to camp, hearts pounding, weapons drawn. Every instinct screamed to run, to get out while we still could. But pride and fear rooted us to the spot. We spent the rest of the night with the fire raging, and every light we had burning, backs to the flames, weapons trained on the black wall of trees that seemed to creep closer with every passing hour. We never saw it, but we knew it was there, waiting, watching. For years afterward, my buddy and I called it the ghost of Sawmill Mountain, joking about it like it was some campfire legend we had invented. It made it easier to laugh it off, to pretend that what we felt those nights was just imagination, just nerves. But the truth always lingered, heavy and undeniable beneath the surface. We kept going back to Sawmill Mountain from time to time, always with bigger groups, always during the busier seasons. And nothing ever happened. No strange silences, no unseen watches, no guttural growls from the woods. It lulled us into thinking maybe it really had been nothing after all. Maybe the forest had just been playing tricks on two tired young men. But then, a few years ago, during a conversation with my buddy over text, the truth resurfaced. We were reminiscing about old times, and I mentioned casually how I used to think it had been a mountain lion that had stalked us back then. His response chilled me. He didn't think it was a mountain lion at all. He thought it had been a Sasquatch. At first, I laughed it off, but the more he explained, the tactics, the silence, the overwhelming sense of being hunted, the more it made sense. I started digging into reports, reading about other encounters, and what I found mirrored our experiences almost exactly. The heavy silence, the oppressive presence, the sense that whatever was out there wasn't just curious, it was dominant, predatory, watching and waiting. It changed the way I thought about Bigfoot entirely. I used to think of it like folklore, a shy creature avoiding human contact, maybe some relic of a forgotten era. But now, I'm not so sure. Maybe they're not shy at all. Maybe they're the real apex predators of the wilderness, smart enough to hide, patient enough to stalk, and dangerous enough that most people never even realize how close they've come. I haven't been back to Sawmill Mountain alone since that realization. I'm not sure I ever will. Some places remember you, and some things, once they've set their eyes on you, don't easily forget. Story 5. UFO Lights and the Round Lake Horror. It was the spring of 1988, and for a bunch of college kids desperate to escape finals and responsibility, there was no better plan than heading into the Sierra Nevada mountains for a week of hiking and camping. There were 7 of us all together, 4 guys, 3 girls, all crammed into battered cars packed with gear, youthful energy, and the kind of reckless optimism that comes from thinking the world can't really touch you yet. One of our friends had a father who knew the area well and recommended a spot near a place called Round Lake. It wasn't on any official campground maps, more of a locals-only, word-of-mouth kind of place. Perfect, we thought. Remote enough to feel like a real adventure, close enough to get back if anything went wrong. The hike up to our chosen site was grueling but beautiful, all sweeping vistas and thick pine forests, the air crisp and sharp with the scent of melting snow. We found a wide clearing with a stunning view of the lake below, set up our tents and spent the first day doing all the usual camping things, building a fire, cooking, laughing until our faces hurt. By the second evening, everything still felt perfect. After dinner, a couple of our group decided to wander off to find a good spot to watch the sunset. The rest of us stayed behind, stretching out by the fire, trading stories and sipping cheap beer. There was a kind of magic to it, the crackle of the fire, the stars just starting to wink to life overhead, the slow hum of the forest around. Us? We thought we were alone up there, miles away from anything or anyone. We were wrong. It started with the two who had wandered off to catch the sunset. They came running back into camp just as the last light was draining from the sky, faces pale and breathing hard. At first, we thought they were just messing with us, trying to scare everyone for a laugh. But one look at them, wide eyes, shaking, hands, and we knew it was real. They stumbled over each other's words trying to explain. They had been sitting on a rocky ledge overlooking the valley when they noticed a pine tree below shaking violently. It wasn't a gentle sway like the breeze might cause. It was thrashing, whipping back and forth as if something massive was moving it. At first, they thought it might be a bear, or maybe a deer crashing through the underbrush. But then they caught sight of something. They described it as a black shape, huge and bulky, moving with an awkward, almost broken gait. It propelled itself forward with its front limbs, dragging its back legs as if they didn't quite work right. It was only when it paused in a clearing and rose up onto two legs that they realized this was no animal they had ever seen. It was enormous, towering even while slouched, and covered in matted dark fur. One of them described it as the biggest freaking chimp you've ever seen. But even that didn't feel right. It moved wrong. Too fast, too heavy, too deliberate. Naturally, the rest of us wanted to see it for ourselves. Grabbing flashlights and cameras, we trekked back with them to the ridge where they had been. But by the time we got there, the thing, whatever it was gone. All that remained was the unsettling memory and a stretch of forest that suddenly felt much darker and more oppressive than it had earlier that day. Standing there, looking out over the valley, a strange silence pressed down on us. It wasn't the peaceful quiet we had enjoyed earlier. It was a vacuum, a tension in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of our lights, something was watching, and somehow we knew. We hadn't seen the last of it. We were still standing on that ridge, flashlights darting nervously through the trees, when someone pointed to the sky. "Do you guys see that?" my friend said, voice tight with disbelief. We all looked up and froze. Above the treetops, spinning lights hovered in the eastern sky. They weren't attached to anything we could see. No helicopters, no aircraft, no structure. Just orbs of brilliant white light, rotating slowly in a tight, deliberate pattern. At first they were distant, almost benign, but with every few minutes they seemed to inch closer, growing brighter, sharper against the dark sky. Before we could process what we were seeing, the air around us shifted. A low moan, deep and resonant, rolled through the forest. It started off faint, almost like the groan of wind through old trees, but quickly grew louder, more human, almost anguished. It echoed from the right, then the left, then above us. It was impossible to pinpoint. Every time the light spun closer, the moaning would intensify, building to a strange, high-pitched whooping sound that seemed to shudder the very ground beneath our boots. We huddled together, backs to each other, flashlights scanning in every direction. No one dared speak. The atmosphere was thick with something unseen, something electric, and not a single one of us doubted anymore that we were at the center of something profoundly wrong. Then someone gasped and pointed into the woods. There, flitting between the trees, was a figure, small, silver-white, almost glowing. It moved quickly, darting from trunk to trunk, its body too fluid, too unnatural. It was no animal, no person. It shimmered in the darkness like a living ghost, and wherever it went, the strange lights in the sky seemed to respond, pulsing in time with its movements. We stood frozen, hearts pounding in our ears as the moans and whoops built to a deafening crescendo. The lights above us spun faster, tighter, the air crackling with unseen energy. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lights blinked out. The noises fell silent. And for one long, terrifying moment, the forest was utterly still, like the eye of a storm we hadn't even realized we were in. But somewhere deep in the blackness we knew we weren't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't done with us yet. For a moment we stood paralyzed, clinging to the hope that whatever had just happened was over. Then came the crack, a sharp splintering sound from the trees directly behind us. One of the girls screamed, and we all whipped around just in time to see it. A massive figure, easily over 11 feet tall, emerged from the darkness at the edge of our camp. It stood upright, swaying slightly from side to side, breathing heavily. The firelight caught its matted dark fur, and for a brief, horrifying second, its glowing red eyes locked onto us. The Sasquatch. It inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, and exhaled with a low rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground under our feet. Behind it, flickering shadows hinted at more movement, more figures, pale and flickering, darting through the woods like phantoms. We didn't wait for a second invitation. Someone yelled, "Run!" and instinct took over. We scattered, abandoning. Tents, backpacks, everything. The only thought was to reach the cars. The trail back was a blur of stumbling feet, breaking branches, and panicked shouts. I don't remember making conscious choices, only the primal, overwhelming need to get away from whatever was behind us. When we finally burst into the clearing where we had parked, gasping for breath, we didn't even slow down. We piled into the vehicle, slamming doors, fumbling keys, tires spinning in the dirt. As we sped down the winding dirt roads, none of us dared to look back. The forest swallowed the campsite behind us, and whatever had claimed it. We never camped there again, and deep down we all knew something had seen us that night, something that didn't want to be found. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.